been looking for our technology person, but since we are sort of semi-high-tech today, we can start with the part that will be in person. And welcome you very much to the session panel number 6 on digital trade. And actually, as you will see from the presentations of our distinguished panels, we will in fact not only look into digital trade, we will also look into digital sovereignty, regulatory fragmentation, the technological divide that of course dominates the e-commerce debate, and also the digital trade talks in Geneva. And we will also look at technology transfer aspects linked also to investment screening, because two panels have been merged into one. And we will then into from national experience, from regional experience into the multilateral level, and have a concluding round where all the speakers will look at the multilateral aspect of this. But I start by inviting each of the panelists to briefly introduce themselves. Just tell us where you teach, what you're doing. I think you can do it better than I do.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Neha Mishra, and I teach at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Natália Figueiredo. Currently, I'm collaborating as a researcher at FGV, law school in São Paulo, and I have been recently admitted as a professor at the Federal University of São Paulo.
Hi everyone, my name is Rafael Tamayo. I teach international law here at the Universidad Rosario, but I am also part of the WTO Chairs program team in Colombia.
Good afternoon, my name is Juan Pablo Gómez. I work in a law firm here in Bogotá, and I also teach at the Universidad of Andes. I am a member of the Chairs program as well there.
And then I should introduce online also Alex Beyleveld. When our technician is back, we will put him on the main screen. Unfortunately, he couldn't come to Bogota, but he will join us from Witwatersrand University from South Africa, and he will focus on the competition and digital protocol of the African Free Trade Agreement. But let's start with you, Neha. You have as your topic, chosen as your topic under this heading, the topic of digital economy agreements as a response to digital trade fragmentation. So maybe to start with, could you contextualize this a little bit in terms of what kind of areas of digital trade and other aspects and problem areas your theory covers, and maybe you continue to explain what the DFA model consists of.
So to just give you some context for my paper, and I think for some of the other discussions we will have as well, what I'm looking at is fragmentation and digital trade. And there are two aspects in which I'm looking at fragmentation. So there's one component of fragmentation, which is the regulatory fragmentation. So fragmentation in terms of privacy or cybersecurity or consumer protection or different kinds of laws related to data flows. And this is something that is discussed quite a bit these days within trade policy circles. But the other aspect that I look at in my work is technical fragmentation, which is essentially fragmentation of the internet as a network, as an infrastructure, and all the applications and services that run on top of this base infrastructure. And that's something that's usually not discussed within the trade policy context. You usually find that discussion in internet policy and internet technical bodies. But to think of digital trade fragmentation as a whole, I think it's important to look at both the regulatory and the technical fragmentation aspects. And the reason why it's important to bring these two together is because ultimately digital trade is contingent on interconnectivity of networks, and that is determined by both these factors. Now, what I specifically do in my paper is to look at how we respond to this fragmentation, because we know it creates problems for digital trade. And I look at a very specific policy intervention, which is the digital economy agreements, Some of you might know it's quite a new thing in the trade world. It started about 3 years ago. The first agreement was the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, which was between Singapore, Chile, and New Zealand. And there have been a few subsequent agreements with other countries as well. Now, there is no specific prototype of a DEA model, but what is clear is that these models are intended to only look at the digital sector. So you look at the digital economy as a whole. So it's different from traditional trade agreements where you have provisions on trade in goods, trade in services. So it's much more cross-cutting, but only specifically dealing with the digital economy. In terms of the architecture, again, there are no stereotypes. For instance, there are certain digital economy agreements like the DIPA, which I mentioned, which is a sui generis agreement, which means essentially it's not based on any FTA. On the other hand, some of the more recent digital economy agreements between UK and Singapore, Singapore and Australia, and also between Korea and Singapore are based on an FTA model in the sense that the two parties have negotiated a digital economy agreement, but that has replaced the e-commerce chapter within their FTA. The third model, which is some people would argue still falls broadly within the DA model, is a broader political partnership between countries that may take the form of a trade agreement or may not. And some people would say the digital trade pillar of the IPEF model would also probably qualify as a digital economy agreement. So essentially, that's what the digital economy agreement model looks like, and maybe I can discuss about it a bit further.
Yeah, that was very good as the overview to contextualize it for all of us. This is not only a question of regulatory fragmentation, but it's also a broader topic, not only issues of privacy, cybersecurity, and these kind of issues, but also you wrote in your paper that fragmentation is also a product of a reduced digital trust because of the growing geopolitical divides and the trends towards digital sovereignty. And we will hear this topic, this will be a common theme through a number of these presentations. So we look at the technical issues, we look at the digital trade, the potential it offers, we look at regulatory fragmentation, especially also governments not being able anymore to exercise their sovereignty in the cyberspace. And there are also consumer protection issues involved, all of which actually we will come towards the end to talk about again when it comes to e-commerce talks in Geneva. These kind of issues also matter at the multilateral level. Maybe to go back to your DA model, what valuable contributions can these DA models contribute, make to resolving the issues I just mentioned?
So as I mentioned, the DA model is quite new. We still don't know where it's headed, but what I have highlighted in the paper is that they really have the potential to bridge some of the gaps that we see in the digital trade world today. And there are three reasons why I think they really can make this value-added contribution. The first one is that they avoid the normal trade-offs that is very common to FTAs. As I explained, in FTAs, you could be negotiating cars for e-commerce, or at the WTO, you could be negotiating the e-commerce moratorium for food security, for instance. The digital economy agreement solely focuses on the digital world. So the negotiations are very specific to the digital world, and that kind of prevents holding up issues which countries are otherwise willing to negotiate in the context of digital trade. The second big advantage, I think, of DEA is just shifting the vocabulary and the focus from high politics to low politics. And we've already seen a lot of discussions on national security, for instance, how difficult it is to talk on these issues. But if you look at these digital economy agreements, the thrust is on creating digital trust. And Werner identified some of the main areas they are looking at. And as a result, the focus shifts on creating regulatory frameworks that can enable trust, and it's across a range of areas, things like logistics, e-payments, e-invoicing, to more complicated issues of data certification, data standards, and even more difficult issues of data localization. But there is a range of issues that it looks at, and it moves from the topic of dispute settlement to more broader topics of how can we create common frameworks, common protocols, common norms that can help countries engage in digital trade together. And the last point why I think they make a value-added contribution is because of just the architecture and the normative output that comes through the process. The architecture is quite flexible. So for instance, if you look at the DIPA, it has a modular structure, which can, and you can even take a particular module and incorporate in another trade agreement. But also in terms of the normative output, it's a lot of it is based on soft law mechanisms. And that is a big advantage for the digital world, because people who are familiar with digital and data regulation would know that it requires a lot of multi-stakeholder engagement, and having very binding, inflexible norms can be really problematic for these kinds of issues. So one of the biggest advantage is really that in a range of areas, starting, as I said, from the basic issues of digital aid facilitation, moving on to AI, fintech, RegTech, LawTech, data innovation, there are multiple ways in which it creates very substantive mechanisms for soft law, development of soft law, and that's something that you find across all DAs, and I think that makes it also a very valuable instrument to look at.
That's very fascinating, but let's turn the table for a moment. And you mentioned already it offers flexibility in addressing the digital divide and also the fragmentation that exists. But as long as there is a regulatory fragmentation or no regulation, at least digital trade can happen. Doesn't the flexible model and the modular structure that you just described and the fact that it may have to be soft law also have counter disadvantages in a sense that it could maybe lead to even more fragmentation or entrenched fragmentation on a regional or national, regional or multilateral level? So what are the risks of that approach?
One of the things that often is discussed in the context of digital regulation, and especially these DA models, is that because they are so open and they are so flexible in nature, it's really contingent on the political will of the parties, what they are willing to negotiate. And that is often seen as a risk, because it's really going to then be a few like-minded countries that are going to negotiate on these rules. But if you look at the substantive core of these disciplines, there's actually a lot to be explored further. So just to give you an example, there are a lot of provisions in these DAs that deal with interoperability. And when they talk about interoperability, it's just not technical interoperability, it's also different forms of legal interoperability. And some of these interoperability are in very low-hanging areas, things like e-invoicing, digital identities, or e-payments, or electronic records. And if this model is successful, and if you can really figure out what are the ways in which these interoperable frameworks work in these areas, then they can be used in more complicated areas like data exchanges or data standards. And that's a big advantage. And that, rather than fragmenting, actually helps build more coherent framework. Similarly, I already mentioned that DAs provide many avenues for multi-stakeholder engagement. So for instance, there are provisions on digital inclusion, which allow parties to talk to civil society bodies. There are provisions on online safety and security, which allow talking to internet policy setting bodies. There are provisions on standard setting, which allow discussion with internet technical bodies. So rather than fragmenting, this is actually an organic opportunity to incorporate many relevant international benchmarks by reference, and to give importance to the bodies which are actually doing the work out there, instead of shifting into a trade fora which may not have the expertise to deal with such a wide range of issues. So in essence, because it's so focused on creating common trust mechanisms, common regulatory frameworks, principles, and standards, I think it will help in bridging fragmentation rather than creating more fragmentation in the digital space.
You're very good at marketing the model because you're turning the weaknesses into strength. But I think I can see your point that the low-hanging fruit could certain areas of digital fragmentation could be overcome. It's actually an approach that is happening currently in Geneva, that you focus on the issues on which you can more easily agree on, and then maybe fragmentation is already a fact because we have so many other actors, big companies, areas of non-regulation, but also actors like OECD, APEC, and Central, that you already have a spaghetti bowl of regulation. Maybe it overcomes this way. But against this backdrop, we will spare the question on the multilateral level to a final round where we can put together then all the different models and look at it, what we can learn from them for multilateralism. But because we have this spaghetti bowl of different kinds of regulatory approaches, what are the possible challenges and limitations of this model? And let's look at it from the perspective also from developing country perspectives, because of course the more advanced economies find their way. To some extent, multilateral corporations manage to trade and to take advantage of the digital economy, regardless of fragmentation or over-regulation. But when it comes to digital divide and technology transfer, additional mechanisms are necessary in order to make developing countries partake in digital trade, especially least developed countries. So if we look at the challenges and limitations from a development perspective, what is your answer to that question?
So very specific so I'm not trying to necessarily say that this is the best model out there. I'm just saying it's a good model and it can provide certain solutions to problems that we are seeing in the digital trade world today. But from a more architectural level, there are obvious problems with these DAs. As I said, it's a sui generis model. There are a lot of uncertainty. So for instance, we don't know how exactly the dispute settlement mechanisms will work. What if there are conflicts with FTAs or multilateral framework? There are also no answers around, and there are also certain variations in the language across these different DAs, and that can also create confusion. But more specific, and I think the developing country question is at the heart of the problem, because essentially what these DAs are trying to create is a more inclusive, more collaborative, more interconnected world. But at the same time, with the exception of Chile, we don't actually have many developing countries which have still participated in any of these DAs. There has been some interest from Peru and some Asian developing countries, but so far they haven't participated. And there are many loopholes in these DAs which arise as a result of it. So for instance, there's a lot of focus on open standards across all these DAs. And it is defined quite broadly, unlike the WTO treaties, for instance, where standard is defined much more narrowly. But at the same time, we know how standard setting works. It is always driven by the richer countries, players in richer countries. And so when you want to talk about open standards and what should be the right open standards, if you don't have enough developing countries voicing their concerns, then you're not getting the most inclusive, the most sustainable model in the long run. So I think that's one big area where there is there's something missing. There's another area that has been, and you mentioned technology transfer, but more broadly in terms of supporting developing countries and LDCs. And I know at the WTO as well, in the e-commerce discussions, this has been brought up, especially by China and Indonesia. They've made proposal for a TFA-like agreement, very specific to digital trade. And there are no such rules. There are some high-level provisions referring to technology transfer, or there are some provisions referring to digital inclusion, but there's nothing really substantive. And that's, again, a big miss. And if you have to incentivize more countries to join these DAs and to benefit from them, that's something to think about. Perhaps the reason could be because it is quite new and most developing countries are anyway skeptical to negotiate on these issues. But that's, I think, a big area where there is a loophole. But in addition to that, there are other areas where I think the DAs could do better. For instance, there are no specific references, but there are provisions on source code, there are provisions on cryptography, but there is no specific reference to government access to data. But there is a new OECD declaration which sets out high-level principles. And again, maybe in the future, they could be incorporated by reference. So there are these tiny loopholes, but again, these are living agreements. They are meant to evolve as the digital economy evolves. So I'm a little more optimistic in that regard.
Well, thank you very much. We will get back to the multilateral dimension later. We discussed finally development issues and technology transfer and digital divide. We looked at some examples in your work from Asia, from ASEAN, but also from other world regions. One world region that is quite innovative in this respect is Africa. We face a paradigm shift here. Some years ago, Africa would have been resistant to regional integration and believing in the benefits of free trade. Now it's the North that rethinks this. We heard this morning in the first sessions all the skepticism. But in Africa, very fascinating things happen. There is an agreement on an African free trade agreement that has already a number of chapters, for example, a chapter on a protocol on digital trade. But it also has unfinished business that is in the making, the potential, an AFCFTA protocol on competition policy. Because when we look at digital trade and the fact that multinational corporations dominate the field, it's an area where competition law also has a role to play. Antitrust is also very important, and the absence of it leads to a situation where some mega companies dominate the world market here. With this transition to Africa, I turn to Alex Beyleveld, who joins us. Of course, in the digital panel, we need to have at least one participant participating digitally. But of course, it has a sad connotation because you were trying to get the visa. So please take the floor and we look at the first question. What is this protocol on digital trade, but more importantly, the protocol on competition policy in the AFCFTA, and how can it navigate economic inequalities, and how can it contribute to bridging the digital divide? Alex, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Werner. Can I just confirm you can hear me, right?
Very well, very well.
Excellent. So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to the organizers for enabling me to participate online. I do wish I was there with you, but I'm really grateful for the opportunity. And so too is my co-author, Franziska, who's not here, but yeah, the thoughts that I express here are hers as well. So yeah, thank you also, Werner, for the introduction. I think just to add some clarity, the AFCFTA digital trade protocol is still being negotiated, and the competition policy, the protocol on competition policy, there is a draft version that has been adopted by the African Union already. So our paper essentially looks at some contextual factors, namely the growth of an increasing salience of the digital and data economies over the course of the past, say, 4 decades or so. And then we look at the sort of evolving economic inequalities during that same period, sort of the shifts that you've seen at various different levels. And we look at sort of 3 in particular. The first has to do with sort of the international level, if you will, where you see Asian economies, particularly China, sort of catching up, if you will, to North America and Europe, and this gap between them sort of diminishing economically, and that driving sort of the geopolitics we think of our day. And then we sort of try to situate Africa within that context and say, well, during that same period, Africa's sort of fallen behind, not only North America and Europe, but also to a large degree, Asian economies. This is a reductionist view. There are many complexities to this debate. Of course, Africa is not a country. It is a continent with 54 countries in it in this context, and they have different experiences. But given that we're dealing with sort of a continental level market, we look at it as a whole and sort of just see how it has sort of fallen behind these other regions. So that's one level that we look at it at. The other is we look within the AFCFTA. We look at inequalities between state parties within the AFCFTA and look at sort of regional powerhouses, if you will, and the differences and the big gaps between countries within the continent. And then finally, we look at inequalities within AFCFTA state parties. And then we sort of have done some other work on what we think rules in the protocol on digital trade might look like to try and navigate some of these distributional inequalities. But here we take as a given that that protocol is going to more carefully integrate the digital economies on the African continent. And we ask ourselves, okay, given that that's the case, and given this landscape that we've painted already, where sort of existing digital MNEs are dominant, as Werner had already alluded to, and African economies are by and large sort of digital latecomers, as they've sort of come to be known. How might the protocol on competition policy go about helping navigating these sorts of inequalities? So yeah, I think that's more or less where we're headed with the paper.
Thank you very much for this introduction, Alex. If we're looking at the competition policy protocol, and thanks for correcting that the competition policy protocol is the one that is de facto adopted, and the other one is trade is the draft, but it's not still under negotiation. So if we have multinational enterprises that are present in the market, so how is this protocol capable, or what is the potential in overcoming the digital divide, but also navigating these economic inequalities? Because obviously there are issues of national sovereignty and digital sovereignty that are at stake here.
Right. Yeah, so in the paper, we try to explain what we mean by navigating economic inequalities, right? So we frame this sort of largely around the idea of African countries being able to pursue what we call an inclusive digital development agenda. And we leave that notion deliberately somewhat vague, as we think it's something that needs to be open for discussion. But in essence, the competition policy, the protocol on competition policy should help navigate economic inequalities in the sense that the conduct of firms or undertakings in third states should not prevent African countries, or their firms rather, from pursuing some sort of inclusive digital development agenda. Similarly, other firms on the continent should be caught by competition disciplines, and AFCFTA state parties should be able to pursue measures that address domestic inequalities despite the behavior of firms in other countries. And I think this is particularly pertinent in the digital economy, where you don't always need a physical presence to operate somewhere. So just specifically on the protocol, the protocol does set up some rules that you might expect to find, at least the competition policy protocol does set up some rules that you might expect to find in national level competition rules. And it provides a continental dimension to that. So conduct that has a continental dimension will be subject to these rules. And it gives an authority power to sort of do some investigations and pursue, much like a national level competition authority would, remedies in the context of anti-competitive behavior. And there's a particular section also that goes specifically to the digital economy, which seems to us to be largely borrowed from the EU's Digital Markets Act, which sort of deals with gatekeepers and so on, and platforms, which we think is quite an interesting provision. And in enforcing that provision, and as well as the more generic competition law provisions in the protocol, we think that it sort of helps potentially protect intra-African value chains from anti-competitive behavior engaged in by undertakings in third parties, particularly when there's under-enforcement in a third party, and you sort of export your lack of competition enforcement to Africa. We also think that it helps pool resources for enforcement efforts, which is particularly useful for state parties with sort of weaker enforcement capacities, of which we think there are quite a number on the continent. And then finally, looking to the longer run, we think it sort of helps pool economic and negotiating power and clout to pursue sort of, maybe we can talk about this later, but down the line, sort of ideally multilateral rules that help counter anti-competitive behavior, and it sort of gives African countries a shared position on competition rules in the digital economy, which we see as a useful contribution of the protocol. Yeah, I think I'm going to stop there for now, Werner.
Yeah, we come to the last question a little bit later, but it's very interesting. I think you set the stage for the specific issues that arise when you apply antitrust rules in the digital trade arena. You mentioned value chain protections. You mentioned enforcement efforts that are, of course, chronically endowed in Africa. We maybe come back later also in the Q&A session. How do you really then pool resources for enforcement of antitrust law? And then also the question of the fact that the actors are not necessarily in, of course, the servers and the headquarters of the companies situated somewhere else, not in the countries where they operate. And it's in the nature of the digital economy that the actors are not necessarily, they can supply their services, and a digital trade obviously happens through the cyberspace, but at the same time, economic development and closeness to the consumer is a competitive edge, and therefore investment into this area and local presence is an important issue. And that brings us to the next speaker, which is Natália, and she has been looking at investment-related issues in this context. I think we need to put some slides on the screen now. Yes. So we're looking at investment screening mechanisms. Are there undue barriers to international transfer of technology? So one common theme of these presentations is when you talk about digital trade, we also talk about digital divide and transfer of technology. And investment is, of course, a way to bridge that gap. The classic theory is that investment will lead to transfer of technology. And we are now looking into how this happens and what are the screening mechanisms and the controls that are necessary here, because then big M&Es become locally present. We've heard this, usually investment screening is about inward investment. That's the classic way of looking at this. We heard this morning in another panel when it comes to national security. We are now looking also at outward screening. But I'm sure you will explain this paradigm shift to us, and then we look at a number of questions. Natália, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, my goal is to share some initial thoughts about the potential impact of the new investment screening mechanism on the transfer of technology to developing countries, and also on regulation of technology transfer. Well, this proliferation of these investment screening mechanisms based on national security grounds is a new phenomenon. And there are a few research institutes and research projects, especially in Europe and the US, that are exploring this new topic, especially from the perspective of high-income countries. And at the Center for Global Law and Development at FGV, where I collaborate now as a researcher, we're trying to understand this new topic from the perspective of developing economies and emerging markets. And if we check here this map, it's very interesting. I made this map based on a recent UNCTAD report that points out that there are at least 37 inbound investment screening mechanisms nowadays. And I classify these countries based on their income. So as you can see here, 78% of this investment in inbound investment screening mechanisms, they are from high-income countries. So we can see here that this is not a trend in low and middle income countries, but this is a trend from high-income countries. So how does this happen, and what's the origin of this new phenomenon? So after the global economic and financial crisis in 2008, and with the expansion of outward foreign direct investment from developing countries, developed countries started increasing their regime for screening investment, inbound investment. And also from 2016 on, we had an expansion of reforms on this inbound investment screening mechanism, especially also from high-income countries. Well, nowadays, conversations are also underway to implement not only inbound investment screening mechanisms, but also outbound investment screening mechanisms. Conversations are underway in the US and in Europe, but nothing yet has been implemented. So we'll see what will happen. And what are the drivers for the implementation of these investment screening mechanisms? There are various drivers, including the current geopolitical tensions between the US allies and China, more recently the geopolitical tensions between the US and the Western countries and Russia, the perceived vulnerabilities of production chains, which was intensified by the impact of the COVID-19. But today I would like to call attention to a specific driver, which is technology. Advanced technologies such as artificial intelligence, biomanufacturing, quantum computer, microelectronics, and also dual-use technologies have been a major concern among the framework of this investment screening mechanism. And we know that these technologies that are associated to the fourth industrial revolution, they will make a revolution on production patterns, consumption patterns, and the countries that lead in these technologies, they will also have they will not only enjoy economic benefits, but they will have power. So many countries are introducing critical technologies or high technologies within the frameworks of their investment screening mechanisms. And from this perspective, these investment screening mechanisms seem to have been used as an industrial policy, especially on the part of high-income countries, to establish themselves in particular technological fields. And this is also evidenced by the fact that 17, if you can skip to another slide, so 18 out of 25 of the most innovative countries, according to the WIPO Innovation Index, they do adopt investment screening mechanisms. So this means that technology is really important to them. They're using this as an industrial policy to achieve their goals in technological fields.
So it's quite fascinating to see. I think it's counterintuitive from what you normally hear. When we think about investment screening, we think of developing countries. The map showed the opposite. It's quite interesting. And now is the geostrategic dimension that we heard about, you just mentioned, I heard about this morning, it's going to get worse. So we are in a situation where we need to overcome digital fragmentation. We need to transfer technology. We've heard how competition law plays a role. If outward investment is happening, that's one way of tackling the problem. But we are in a situation where maybe foreign direct investment of this multinational enterprises will not happen, and the digital infrastructure in developing countries will not be created because of such mechanisms. So what is the effects of such ISMs on technology transfer?
Well, it's important here to say that the economic development and technological progress of developing countries are highly influenced or dependent on the access of these countries to technology of developed countries. So I believe that these investment screening mechanisms can have at least two effects on the transfer of technology to developing countries. First of all, if we think of this inbound investment screening mechanism, they can restrict investments made by multinational corporations from developing countries. If we remember the beginning of this conversation, the implementation of inbound investment screening mechanism was also to some extent a response to the expansion of outward foreign direct investment of developing countries. And developed countries are particularly concerned with this type of multinational from developing countries because most of them are state controlled or have some influence from the state. So if they started using this investment screening to bar investment from these multinational companies, this could be a way to limit the technology access on the part of developing economies. And if we have the implementation of outbound screening investment, then that could potentially restrict the foreign direct investment to developing countries. And why? Because these investment screening mechanisms, they are part of also of a strategy of friendshoring. So we are not sure that developing countries are considered friends or like-minded countries of developed countries or high-income countries. And therefore, we're not sure that these investments will be diverted to the developing countries, especially considering the relationship, the trade and diplomatic relationships of developing countries with China. For example, Brazil is a good example. Vera was mentioning the number of exports of Brazil to China in another panel. So I can see that all this could have negative impacts, potential negative impacts on the technology transfer to low and middle income countries and on their innovation and productive levels, potentially widening the technological divide between developed and developing countries.
Thank you. I think we will then later on in the next round get back to the question what that means for the multilateral level and what lessons or risks we have to identify for that. And of course, it also has an impact or goes hand in hand with the tendency towards reshoring and friendshoring, where investment mechanisms far beyond the area of digital trade are being used. Now, let's shift to our last two speakers. Muchas gracias por su paciencia. But I think we had to cover a number of questions together because it's difficult to just shift with so different topics from one speaker to the next. I think we needed to cover each area to some extent. Now, we are guests in a continent that has in recent years voted for more and more left-wing governance. 10 years ago, there was very few left-wing governments left in Latin America, and that has changed recently, also in our host country. So the question then arises, the title of your paper is Digital Imperialism, Understanding Fragmentation in the Data-Driven Economy. So when I hear this, obviously the word imperialism seems like coming from a different era. But at the same time, when we look at the situation that we have 7 main players in the multinational corporations that dominate the digital economy when it comes to the infrastructure, some of them in the US, some of them in China, and we heard in other panels this morning, we don't even know the names of the Chinese competitors here. And in the preparation, I was saying, well, it wasn't colonialism and imperialism really something coming from governments in the 19th century. And here we're in a situation where even the governance in the countries where the players come from are fully capable of controlling these companies, or sometimes they don't do much in terms of regulation because they think it's going to give them a competitive edge towards competitors. But then after we spoke, I rethought this again, and I thought, actually, when I go back to the origins of colonialism, it was not states, it was the East India Company, it was Belgium running Congo as a private company. So maybe your model, if you go back long enough in time, could be an interesting way of looking at this. So maybe I start with Rafael. We have divided up the questions to the two of you. What can you describe the broader topic of analyzing the political economy of the data-driven economy, and what do you mean by that, and what are the critical implications of your overall argument about digital imperialism?
Thank you for your question, Werner. First of all, I want to clarify that we are working in this project in conjunction with our colleague René Urueña, who unfortunately couldn't be here with us. As I said, what we're trying to do in this paper is understanding implementation in cross-border data transfer regulation from the perspective of imperialism theory. In order to do that, we have to understand digital trade as something more like technological and computational capacities applied to commerce. What we are trying to present with this argument is that there has been a critical transformation in the capitalist structure. So we draw on critical accounts that perceiving the influence of digital technologies on the economy are entailing significant changes to social relations under capitalist societies, such as production relations, exchange relations, and capital accumulation. Digital technologies inform each of these processes inherent to capitalism, understood as an abstract system or economic structure. Simply put, capitalism structural features in this political economic context have adapted to the concrete series of historical developments that characterize the so-called digital age. So there have been several accounts of how digital technology has fundamentally altered or changed forces of production and accumulation regimes under contemporary capitalism through concepts such as surveillance capitalism, platform capitalism, and informational capitalism, among others. These accounts describe that most corporations are turning their business models to producing and trading data commodities. Therefore, personal data extracted from internet users and linked together algorithmically has become central for producing digital commodities, especially prediction products about people's behavior that can be monetized, creating patterns of surplus value and capital accumulation. So in summary, and this is like the overall argument, like an introductory argument, we believe that digital trade should be understood in a broader context of digital capitalism, a critical transformation of economic production processes underpinned by the emergence of big data and the exponential increase in computation capacity, facilitating the gathering and processing of data across borders. Within this context, data extraction and processing are the cornerstone of value creation and capital accumulation.
Thank you. Maybe we turn, in the interest of time, quickly to Juan Pablo. And the question to you would be, what are the key challenges currently facing data transfer regulation in terms of fragmentation? And what are the implications for international economic law? So I think your paper is more conceptual. So after looking at all these various dimensions, we're looking back at the conceptual level. And maybe we focus on the national and regional level first. And in the last round, we will look at the multilateral level.
Well, as you said, our paper, which is part of the work we're doing more broadly in the church program, looks at or seeks to find a theoretical framework for understanding what is going on in digital trade. And it has a theoretical part, and it also has a regulatory analysis of what's going on. And this is where challenges come to play. We have identified, I think, 3 big challenges in terms of data transfers that are, to us, really interesting, really important. The first one of them is a question about how to regulate data transfers. We see that there are many paradigms today on how we can do that, and that they are clashing. So we have, for instance, national approaches to the regulation of data transfers. We have regional approaches as well, that I think are the most popular right now. In a resurgence of plurilateralism that I think that has been discussed a lot in the literature. And we also have this question or this quest for multilateral alternatives. And we see, for example, in case of the US, basically today, all of their plurilateral agreements, the US MCA probably is one of the ways regulating these matters through these initiatives. We also have the joint statement initiatives at the WTO ministerial conference, but they remain plurilateral alternatives. So that's the first challenge that we identify. The second is the clash of interests, particularly between developing countries and developed countries. We have made the homework of looking at some communications raised by developing countries during the General Council of the WTO. And many of them raise questions and concerns that tend to clash with the concerns that developed countries have. And of course, this means another challenge of listening and giving a place of developing countries to express how they feel about this regulation, mostly because there's lack, what we consider, of technical knowledge on how to address these matters. And the final challenge is competing regulatory regimes, but most importantly, competing regulatory agendas between these countries. This is an idea that has also been discussed in the literature, and it is that we have like 3 large paradigms right now on how to regulate data transfers. We have the US that is more liberal, and as you were saying, maybe has an influence of big tech companies interested in collecting data and creating value through the collection of that data. One fact that surprised me when I was looking at this for another course was that, for instance, United Airlines paid off their debt during COVID with selling their databases for $20 billion, which to me was surprising how data today represents most value for most companies. Then we have the EU with, I would say, a little bit more restrictive approach with the GDPR that we can discuss later. And finally, we have China with a concept of internet sovereignty. That really what means is more intervention in the way that users interact with internet and the way data transfers take place. And the main implications of these challenges, just very briefly, we also believe that there are 3. The first one is competitive imbalances between market actors, because of course, actors from developing countries cannot access countries that have higher regulations and vice versa, which is important for countries like Colombia, where you have a lot of small companies with an intention to export, and they find these barriers. A second one is a lack of uniformity on the implementation of standards, which means that we have the famous Brussels effect. We have regulations from big economies like the EU being applied de facto extraterritorially to other countries that have not designed their own alternatives. And finally, we have an insufficient technical capacity of some countries addressing these issues. And I just want to close with this. I was talking to a colleague from the EU just before the conference, and I was telling her, we were concerned to find out that most regulations in Latin America have been focusing on issues like regulating digital applications. We have a very famous company here in Colombia that is Rappi, many Latin Americans may know it. But we have not yet reached more complex discussions about technological architecture, data transfers, and so on and so on. That we believe that technical cooperation is paramount to be able to address this problem in our country. So I think that's kind of a high-level overview of that part.
Thank you very much. That was very useful. I mean, we are in a situation that is really almost schizophrenic. We heard this morning from Henry Gao how many dimensions to national security there are in the Chinese notion. At the same time, and the US does reshoring and friendshoring and outward investment screening. At the same time, the big players want to benefit from digital trade, but also keep control of it. So it's maybe a new form of imperialism. But let's do a final round. I was thinking if we take this paper on imperialism last, it will wake you all up at Friday afternoon when you were jet lag. But hold your fire for a moment. Let's go back to the multilateral dimension. What are the lessons learned, or what do we need to achieve at the multilateral level in the WTO, but not only? There are other fora, especially when it comes to digital trade and data situations. There are so many, many different fora that could be involved. So I'm turning back to Neha. What are the lessons learned, and what are the implications of what should happen at the international, at the multilateral level, taking the DAA model or other models?
So just taking the DAA model as a specific example, I think I briefly mentioned how they are a legal anomaly of sorts. So it's very difficult to really say what its relationship is going to be with WTO law. And this is also acknowledged in some of the DAs where parties acknowledge, yes, there are rights and obligations under WTO treaties, and if there's any conflict, then we are going to solve it with mutual consultation. But we don't know what's going to happen. But that's one aspect. There are also questions around, should a DA have to be notified to the WTO? Is it similar to an FTA? And again, there are no clear answers. But I would also like to focus a little bit more on the optimistic side, where, especially in terms of route making, where I think there is currently at the WTO very considered deliberation on what to do about digital trade, what kind of rules do we need. And I think what is happening at a more mini level in these DAs, especially coming up with common frameworks, common standards, can really inform those negotiations. So to just give you an example, there is a lot of substantive provisions on digital trade facilitation in these DAs. And there are already certain memoranda and policy actions that has happened on that front, at least between some partners. And that could also give ideas of how to implement a similar framework, whether it's at the plurilateral level or perhaps someday if we have a multilateral framework, then at the multilateral level. And I think it's important in this entire dialogue to not necessarily, so I noticed you mentioned the big three, and I think it is not just the big three that dominates the digital trade world. In fact, most of the consumers of the digital trade world are outside the big three. They are in the developing countries. So I think and it's also quite symbolic that these policy responses of DAs have come from Asian countries. So a lot of economies that are leading are from Asia, and they are not the big weights, at least in the traditional sense. So I think it's important to not necessarily characterize everything in digital trade as a black and white issue. And in that sense, I think DAs again present some ideas for at least creating some building blocks for what might happen with the WTO plurilateral agreement on e-commerce, or some other regional fora, for instance, in Africa or in ASEAN region, as to what should be the foundational principles that can help create more sound digital trade rules. So I'll end there.
Thank you very much. I think that's quite a fair assessment of the situation. I think in Geneva, low-hanging fruits and sometimes very technical issues like electronic signature or privacy issues have been addressed for lack of consensus on other issues. And the big questions, and I think the Asian examples of DEAs that you try to address what you can agree on or what maybe regionally can be regulated, are the low-hanging fruits, and maybe, but we cannot run away from the bigger topics of technological divide, consumer protection, and technology transfer. Now, turning to Africa again, Alex is still with us. Just today, when the CHAIRS program started its annual conference very recently, the DG was also addressing annual meeting in Geneva of the International Chamber of Commerce, and she started by saying in one of these sessions, who would have thought 20 years ago that the North is, raising the wall on security reasons, new trade restrictions, investment incentives are taken away, and free trade is not an ideology or a theory, economic theory that has lots of traction at universities as it used to be 20 years ago. And you have to go to Africa to listen to the benefits of free trade. You have a lot of regional integration, the African Economic Union and the AFCFTA. So against this backdrop, Alex, what lesson can we learn from the experiences of the protocols? Because I think the AFCFTA, like often with regional integration agreements, they have been laboratories and fields of experimentation for new areas. We don't have a digital protocol fully fledged in the WTO. International competition laws is something you have to go back to the International Economic Order of the 60s that international antitrust was discussed. So what are the lessons learned? What could we learn for the multilateral context from these models that Africa has been very innovative in developing?
So I think, to a degree, I should start the answer to that with, we still need to see a little bit because some of these things are still at their infant stages. And, I think there is a clear political goal of moving quickly with all of these protocols, which shows a willingness to get things done, but there are some things that we will only really see a couple of years down the line once these agreements are completed and sort of enter into force, because they still need to be ratified and so on. So with that caveat out of the way, I just think that the structure of the AFCFTA and its protocols, particularly in the digital trade space, sort of do speak maybe a little bit more to the bigger issues, right? So not to the low-hanging fruit only, but also to some other issues like competition. So if we're thinking about these notions that are often sort of put forward of like data free flow with trust and trying to facilitate, trust in the digital economy so that we can have more digital trade and these sorts of things, I think what you learn from the African experience perhaps is that you can't forget about these issues, particularly against the backdrop of inequalities and digital divides and these sorts of things, right? So when you're talking about, trust in the digital economy, having something like competition rules can go a long way, or knowing that you'll have a way of enforcing rules that ensure that the digital economy is fair will go a long way in facilitating trust in the digital economy, right? So I think that's sort of the one thing that I'm starting to take away here. In other work that I'm doing with another colleague, like we look at taxation as well. And of course, like these things have their own fora, but I think if you're trying to persuade a set of countries to trust enough to sort of have meaningful rules on digital trade at the multilateral level, you can't dodge things like competition, you can't dodge things like taxation. And if you do have some clarity on how to approach these issues, then I think that can facilitate multilateral discussions to a degree, right? So I think that's something that we're sort of gaining from the AFCFTA architecture, just at least at the outset. As I said, we'll have to see what comes in the coming years as the protocols get implemented.
Thank you very much. I think this is very thoughtful. So we heard from Neha already, we need certain digital agreements in order to resolve some of this regulatory fragmentation issues. I think we have a need for maybe some renaissance of international competition rules. And I like your example you took about taxation. Who would have thought 10, 15 years ago that countries could agree on international minimum taxation? It was unheard of. And thanks to the financial crisis and the pandemic and public budgets going bust, this agreement has been reached, and it's a structure that is quite effective because it has addressed the question of free riding, because in competition law, sometimes countries also think that they can take a comparative advantage by not enforcing certain competition rules. And we have the model of the taxation rules that you mentioned, where we have rules in place that those countries that don't participate will lose tax revenues because other countries will tax instead the same countries. So that's the OECD model. But let's move on for the lessons learned for the multilateral level to Natália. So we are facing now this new world of both investment screening outward and inward, not only inward. Neha mentioned earlier the term, which I quite like, digital trust. It's something that leads to fragmentation or to some extent over-regulation at national level. So if we don't tackle this issue of investment screening or find ways of doing it in a way that doesn't impede digital trade and doesn't impede investment flows, we may not build a digital economy further in a world that goes in the direction of reshoring. So what are your lessons learned from your research for the multilateral level?
Well, first of all, the first lesson would be that these investment screening mechanisms, they have added a new layer to the regulation of technology, which is the national security layer. But by associating technology to national security, the countries have politicized the debate. What is national security anyway? The Copenhagen School of Security Studies, they have a very interesting definition, and that evidences the danger of political nature of this concept. And they understand that that national security is a narrative, is a speech act that is built by the state, and it's full of drama and a certain sense of urgency that is used just to justify exceptional measures. So nothing that is framed within this logic seems to produce very good results. So associating technology with national security has a lot of dangers. This is not to say that technology does not come with risks. We have risks regarding privacy, data security, cyber espionage, and so on, and some dual-use technologies. But we need to frame this into more technical aspects. And it's important to understand that the state alone will not resolve these risks related to technology. This is something that it's something that requires a collaborative effort from other states, from other actors. It's a multi-stakeholder approach. So this will not be resolved through investment screening mechanisms associating technology with national security in the context of unilateral measures. We do need collaborative efforts within the multilateral framework in this respect.
I think that's a very good conclusion. The fact that if you do investment screening nationally, if you have a spaghetti ball of different regulations, and again, to the extent you want to screen investment, and to some extent We're not talking about sustainability to nowadays in this level, but it will be necessary, but it can only work if it's done coherently on an international level. That's a good conclusion. Now let's move on to Rafael and Juan Pablo. If we take the model of imperialism again, it's fun to be the imperialist if you're the only one. And in history, we have had it over time. The Portuguese came, then the Spaniards later on. There was this Cold War between Britain and France, and they sort of divided up the world between them. And then, of course, the world improved. But we are now in a situation where nobody is the only imperialist here. If you talk to about the two superpowers, but also about the big seven multinational companies that dominate the field. So against this backdrop, what are your lessons learned for the multilateral level from your work on this project?
So thank you for I would like to add something to our argument to answer the question, because that's precisely our point. That there is that current health confrontation and regulatory fragmentation can be understood through the lens of imperialism. And the reason is that that's why we started the presentation arguing that we must understand digital trade as a structural transformation in the political economy. So that's the first argument. Then, following this argument, if we are locating within the context of analyzing capitalism, in capitalism, there is a continuous drive for expansion. And obviously, in the 19th century, this growth imperative or the drive for expansion drove imperialist powers to fight against each other, to gain territorial control over the world markets, to obtain access to raw materials and so on. So obviously, we are not comparing the two historical processes. We understand that digital capitalism has specific features adapted to the digital age. But what we are arguing is that imperialism is an inherent logic to capitalism. Therefore, we can explain digital fragmentation as countries or companies in competition, in a struggle. And this struggle drives them to expand digital capitalism to new markets. Therefore, what they are trying to do is to what certain literature refers as datification of everyday life. Like any human activity, any market, any economic activity has to be mediated through this logic of extracting value through data. So, of course, our argument is that there is competition. So that competition is part of the problem. So what developing countries could do, or other actors to break like this imperialist logic of the dynamic, would be use multilateralism to try to set their own agenda. That would include, I'm thinking outside the box, for instance, using WTO negotiations, current initiatives to, for instance, push for solving the digital divide, or again claiming or arguing for more technology transfer, or even this is like a crazy idea. What about a model of access and benefits sharing, similar to the one that applies to the CBD for the biological biodiversity elements to the data extracted from any market whatsoever. My point is that they can use multilateralism to fight this unilateralism that is driven by an imperialist logic, and they can, I don't know, try to get the most from this data economy, which is, something irreversible.
Yes, I just want to make a point, a short point, 1 minute. I'll be more Juan than Rafael. And it's from a policy perspective. Probably what we're trying to say is, we have a saying here in Colombia, in football, when your team is not scoring goals, they're missing every chance they get. I'm trying to translate it best I can. And if you don't score the goals, you'll get them, right? Basically, like Neha said, it's not that there's a black or white answer to the problem, but governments in developing countries have to be conscious that there is this race for the digital divide and to enhance technical cooperation among them to try to regulate it better. And I do believe that we have lessons to learn from Latin American countries, for example. My dear friend here from the WTO chair program in Chile told me yesterday that in the Pacific Alliance reform in 2015, they have the only agreement that incorporates a concept of protecting or promoting net neutrality compared to other agreements that say the same. They don't dare to include those terms, which I think it's very interesting coming from the global south. So I just want to leave that idea there. Of course, there'll be questions, I guess.
Well, thank you very much for that last statement. I think maybe one point I would make in response is that maybe we're still, when we're looking at digital trade and cyberspace, we're still looking at this, even when you're taking this imperialism model, too much in terms of the real world geography. China, US, and the losers and the big companies, when in fact, when we're looking at imperialism, I think your concept in cyberspace. And interesting thought by Rafael, what are the global commons in cyberspace? Maybe digital infrastructure should be a global common. I open the floor. Start with Laurent, and then Ignacio, and then yes.
I have a question about the Marxist approach. It's been a long time since I've heard surface value. I studied this in 1990 when it was still going concern just about. I'm wondering whether that economic approach applies to data, because data has different dimensions, right? It's not just like gold, which is the, or whatever it is that you dig up out of the ground, let alone taking the Marxist view that there's an inherent value in production. Now, what we're talking about, and that's how you get surplus value, right? Personal data, which seems to be what we're talking about, or commercial data, which ultimately comes from personal data, seems to me to be a little bit different. For a start, it means nothing until it's exploited. Right? Also, the person who owns the data can't do anything with it. You can't sell it. You don't have the infrastructure. It's useless. So, for instance, for a digital sovereignty world or entity like the EU, for instance, the EU isn't allowed to, as I understand it, I'm in the UK, so we're in a land of great freedom compared to our unfortunate ex-friends. The EU people are not allowed to use this new Twitter alternative threads, which we are, because the data is allowed to be exported to the US. So I'm told. I wouldn't know. I can use it. That comes at a cost to consumers. And it seems to me that, my question to you would be, is the value in data the same? Even from a Marxist point of view, is it the same as the value in other commodities or items of production to which a Marxist analysis might make evidence?
Okay. Let's take 3 questions and can also think a little bit about the question that gives you a little bit of time.
Thank you. Yeah, my question is more focused on Neha's presentation, but if anyone has an opinion, I would be glad to hear it. Regarding the DIPA, I'm from Chile, so we have looked after the agreement with special interest. And you mentioned that this agreement mentioned technical fragmentation and regulatory fragmentation, and it makes like a major advance by getting together those areas that in principle are separated. And that special concern of mixing these areas is the concern that the principal internet governance agencies in the world has, such as the Internet Governance Forum of United Nations or ICANN at the US. And DIPA covers this. For example, it covers the legal interoperability and the multi-stakeholder approach, but also it covers the internet open architecture and the principle of access and use of the internet. And that reminds us of net neutrality. And do you think that net neutrality is an actual enabler of digital economy or not? Because it's not only DEPA, it's also CPTPP, NAFTA, USMCA. They recognize these principles of access and use of the internet. So it reminds us of net neutrality, but actually no country wants to talk about net neutrality.
Okay, thank you. Let's take two more questions over there, Professor.
Interesting and very thought-provoking panel, so thanks very much. I think I heard the word data localization only once on the panel. My reading of it is that data localization is a real issue for countries. Countries that are able to embed and manage the data localization process can ensure that the firms from their country have the capacity to use the data that they're able to generate locally and potentially then export. And so if your country is not doing that or is not in a position politically to do that, then the data economy or digital economy is not something that their firms will be able to necessarily take advantage of going forward. If that is the case, and I stand to be corrected or better informed, a big issue emerges, which is a lock-in framework, which I think part of the digital imperialism framework is addressing. But as an alternative, recently when I was in Scandinavia, I hear a discussion about fair data, which is based on the framework of looking at fair trade. So I'm wondering if going forward, whether we're talking about different types of agreements, that we could lock in an issue like fair data as a mechanism to deal with some of the issues that have been highlighted here. Thank you.
I think that's a very important addition to the discussion because when I talk about geosecurity, data localization is the big issue. Gentleman at the back.
Thank you very much. My name is Ben. I thought this was a great panel and very collegial, and I sort of want to provoke you. And I'm connecting something Neha said at the beginning to something that I think Rafael said at the end. So Neha was talking about these digital economy as a means to, among other things, de-escalate, move from high politics to low politics, on technical, right? That's where we started the conversation. And we ended the conversation with like, let's think outside the box and get technology transfer, access and benefit, right? And like, and really, these are high political issues, right? These are questions of effectively reparation, right? That's what we're talking. And can we have both of these things, right? I mean, or what? Like, how do we resolve that tension? One way is maybe it's just time horizon. You can have the low stuff first, but the more imaginative stuff is on the horizon. But then I kind of want to bring Natália in and say, like, but some of this is urgent, right? Because the high politics and the investment stream is the high politics. And if we're going to have multilateral standards on something like that, we're going to need some kind of grand bargain if the West or the wealthy countries aren't. So, and so then, like, maybe we need to do high politics, or maybe not, or maybe we do work together in some way that I don't envision. But I'm sort of interested to think about how to reconcile big, scary political issues with the promise of working on the technocratic.
Thank you very much. So let's start with Lauren's question first, I think.
Okay, so that's a great question, and we will have to go to full Marxist theory here. Okay, so your question is, how is value created in the digital capitalism, and if it is enough to call it like a distinct political economic structure? And this has been analyzed in the literature. To give you an example, there is an author, Christian Foch, who has coined the concept of Facebook labor. So basically, what he says is that when we are consumers of these digital platforms are interacting, and we need that because this is how social interaction happens right now. So it's like a human necessity. So what we're doing is we are providing data. So now comes the Marxist theory. Marxist theory says that we're not going to argue the value theory of labor here, but it's something, the logic is something similar. So we as users, we are deprived of our data, alienated in Marxist terms. We don't know. And then the company who has the platform, the digital means, can realize surplus value by producing a data commodity. What is this data commodity? That can take many forms, but basically many uses and uses. But obviously, it's this data that allows or can be used in advertising, in political campaigns for cyber interventions like Cambridge Analytica and so on. So there are many uses, but the idea is how we are alienated or deprived from our data, similar to following Marxist theory. And you can agree or not with that. Following Marxist theory, workers are deprived from the value they create in the process of commodity production. So that's one thing. And then there are another accounts that claim how data has become capital itself. So the idea is these companies are trying to, and there is I don't remember the name of the author, but it's an interesting point because 10 years ago, Suffolk makes the same argument. Many companies didn't know what to do with data. But now they do, and they are trying to gather as much data as possible, even if they don't know what to do with them right now, because they know that there is value. Hence, the idea that data is the new oil. So yeah, there are many ways in which you can monetize data, but the idea or the Marxist approach, and hence all of these concepts of digital capitalism, information and capitalism, and so on, is that there are certain logics of industrial capitalism that can be applied to the process of extracting value from data and having this algorithmically trained data, big data, that you can use in many things. And that's how you extract value. I don't know if that answers the question.
Let me just very quickly on this. The obvious difference is that data is non-rival. There's no value until something is done with it, whereas the idea is that with labor, essentially you're doing something else at that stage. Data is non-rival, right? It means nothing. It costs nothing to have it or not. Yeah. With labor, which is the essence of surplus value theory, it's rival. You're either digging the ditch for your feudal lord, or you're digging the ditch for yourself.
Yeah,
But isn't part of the answer that there are algorithms and they give value to how you process them?
And at no cost to you.
Should we, maybe we can come back to that later. I think Ignacio's questions was mainly directed to.
Yeah, sure. I can briefly answer your question. So the DEPA provision, I think I just double check it's Article 6.2 and it was directly copied from the CPTPP. But the language, if you look at the provision, there is a phrase which says subject to reasonable network management policies. And that kind of provides, and if you then look at the footnote, it says that it also can involve situations where if a content provider is providing something on an exclusive basis for an extra fee, that's not covered within the provision. And that's net neutrality. At least some would argue that that is, hitting at the very core of net neutrality. So I think, and net neutrality, again, it's a long debate, but net neutrality is costly, increasingly costly, because because somebody needs to pay for all the cables that is carrying all these massive Netflix videos. And that makes net neutrality a very difficult concept, especially as digitized content is growing. And that explains why there is that reasonable network management policies. Now it's really up to the discretion of the parties how they read it. And I know in Chile there is a very strong focus, because I think it's also recognized in the constitution or in a legal framework within
not the constitution, but
in the Chilean domestic legal system. Yes, you're right that the DIPA does try to negotiate these boundaries by including internet multi-stakeholder bodies, but I'm not sure to what extent that would work in the long run, especially because net neutrality is economically so difficult to sustain in the long run.
The other two questions are probably more cross-cutting, but I'm being told that we should probably give brief answers because I thought it's not so bad if we go a little bit over time, but I'm told we need to appear for a group photo, and that's also very important. Maybe Natália, do you want to say something about the question about the data localization? Because it's something to do with investment and.
Well, just regarding data localization, and also connecting to the last question regarding the what can we do as related to this grand bargaining for solving all these problems of technological access that's generated in the case of my topic by these investment screening mechanisms? Well, this is a very difficult question. Probably I'm too naive to respond to that, but at least when I show this, when I show that first picture, that first map, demonstrating that this trend of investment screening mechanisms, they are a trend in high-income countries. I just want to raise awareness of developing countries to the effects of these mechanisms on them. And also, another point is raising awareness of countries in general of the anti-democratic nature of national security measures, because if you check the reports from the competent authorities or the publications that they make, it's very opaque and it's it really lacks transparency. We don't have any substantial information about the motivation for their decisions, the countries, even the statistics, they're blurred. So it's really something about the suppression of basic rule of law guarantees. So by raising awareness on this topic, my point would be to make developing countries especially take the lead to discuss these issues on multilateral forums, showing these negative aspects of these mechanisms.
I'm sure we would have questions for another round, but given that we should appear to the photo, maybe I leave this final word we go to Joe Burke. And we ask Alex, do you have reactions to one of those questions, especially the latter?
I think I have reactions to all of them, but not quick ones. When you mention data localization, I get stuck on what it even is to begin with, because it's such a debated topic. And I think if you look at the economic literature on it, it's also kind of complicated. There's a lot to be said about it. So I don't think I can really meaningfully say anything in a very quick period of time. Similarly with the question about the value of data and this debate about it being rivalrous or not, because I think there's actually a debate to be had there. I don't think it's necessarily in all contexts non-rivalrous. At least that's not what some literature says. So I'm going to just thank you all for listening to me earlier and sort of park it there, because these discussions require much more than a couple of seconds. So yeah, thank you very much, guys.
I think that's a good final word, because I think we have approached some solutions, but I think the solution of that panel is there are even more questions than we thought in the beginning, which is also the first cognitive approach one should go through. I would also like to thank the team for connecting us. It was all improvised, but it worked. And I would like to thank the audience for staying and for asking so interesting questions. And apparently, where do we need to go for the photos?
We have to go to the main plaza, which is just down there, where you can see the statue. My team is going to be waiting for you to take a group photo.
So you unfortunately have no time to go back to your hotel room to.